Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 24, verse 7, which reads, "Wisdom is too high for a fool, and the gate he does not open his mouth." You know, let's be honest, right? We live in a culture that is largely democratized opinion. And what I mean by that is, anyone with an internet connection can weigh in on any subject, regardless of how little they actually understand about it. The comments section under a post about economics is full of people with strong economic opinions, right? The thread under a medical article is populated with confident voices who have not spent a day in med school, right? And, even like the debate about complex legal or ethical issues is dominated by people who have never seriously engaged with the complexity of those issues. So everyone has a take, right? But very few people have done the work that would make their take worth hearing. Now, and this is not entirely new though, right? Like human beings have always been capable of speaking confidently about things they do not understand. But the platforms of our current moment have amplified that tendency to a degree that makes Proverbs 24:7 feel startlingly relevant. In this passage, Solomon is not describing a problem unique to our era, but he is describing a consistent feature of foolishness, the gap between what a fool actually possesses and the context that requires something more than what they have. Wisdom is too high for the fool, and the specific context Solomon points to, the gate, the place where real questions about real people get made, is exactly where that gap becomes the most consequential. So let's break down the verse. Wisdom is too high for a fool. The phrase too high is the interpretive center of the first line, and I think it requires careful handling here because it can easily be misread as a statement about intellectual capacity, as if Solomon is saying that wisdom is simply beyond the mental reach of certain people by nature. But that reading, I believe, would make this verse an argument for a kind of fixed intellectual hierarchy, and it would actually contradict the consistent invitation throughout Proverbs for even the simple and the fool to pursue wisdom and find it available to them. The Hebrew word translated too high carries the sense of being exalted, elevated, and lofty. Wisdom is described not as inaccessible by nature, but as occupying a position that requires genuine ascent to reach. It's not locked away behind a door that certain people can't open. It is on the high ground that requires real climbing to access. And so the fool is not constitutionally incapable of reaching it. They simply just have not done the climbing, and in the specific moment that this verse is describing, they are not in a position to access what is only available to those who have genuinely pursued and acquired it. And I think this connects directly to a pattern that we have traced throughout the entire series. Proverbs consistently presents wisdom as available to anyone who genuinely pursues it, but that availability does not mean that it comes without cost or effort. The searching like hidden treasure of Proverbs 2:4, the getting and not forgetting of Proverbs 4:5, the applying of the heart and ears of Proverbs 23:12 that we just examined in the last video, right? All of these describe the genuine work of the ascending to where wisdom actually is. But the fool has not done that work. And so when the moment arrives that requires what only wisdom can provide, the fool is going to find themselves without it. Earlier in the book, in Proverbs 14:6, I think it makes a closely related observation. A scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. The seeking in vain is the fool's experience of wisdom's height. The ease of the man of understanding is the experience of someone who has already done the ascending. And, the wisdom that seems impossibly high from the fool's position is the same wisdom that's going to flow naturally from the position of someone who has genuinely pursued it. And I think the difference is not innate capacity, but it is the accumulated work of genuine pursuit. I think this is also where an important clarification about this verse needs to be made directly. Right? Proverbs 24:7 is not a statement about God's willingness to give wisdom, but James 1:5 remains permanently true. Right? God gives wisdom generously to those who ask. The highness of wisdom in this verse is a statement about what the fool has chosen not to pursue, not about what God has decided to withhold. Right? And so the fool's emptiness at the gate is self-generated through the accumulated choice to despise instruction, scorn correction, and avoid the hard work of genuine formation. So wisdom's height is not the obstacle here, but the fool's unwillingness to climb. Then we have, in the gate, he does not open his mouth. Right, the second half of the verse, I think, is where the practical consequence of wisdom's inaccessibility to the fool becomes visible. And I think understanding the specific context that Solomon is describing is essential to the full impact of the verse. You know, the gate in the ancient Near Eastern city, for context, was not simply an entrance point. It was the civic center of the entire community. The city gate was where legal disputes were heard and adjudicated, where business transactions were witnessed and validated, where community decisions were made, where elders gathered to exercise judgment, and where matters of genuine consequence to the life of the city were debated and resolved. Even in Ruth 4:1-12, you know, it shows us Boaz conducting a legal transaction at a city gate with elders and witnesses. Deuteronomy 21:9 describes parents bringing a rebellious son to the elders at the gate for judgment. Even Job, in 29:7-10, he describes the honored place of the wise man at the gate whose voice shaped community decisions, right? And so the gate was practically where wisdom was required to actually operate in the world on behalf of real people with real stakes. And so in that context, the statement that the fool does not open his mouth at the gate carries significant weight. The silence is not wisdom of the kind we examined in Proverbs 17:28, right, where the fool's silence created the impression of wisdom, but it is the enforced silence of someone who has nothing worth contributing in a context that demands real and genuine wisdom. You know, at the gate, among people who are actually governing, making judicial calls and making decisions that affect others, the fool's emptiness is exposed because they cannot open their mouth because they have nothing to say that the situation requires. And I think that is a different kind of silence than the strategic silence that we see in Proverbs 17:28. And I think that distinction matters because that earlier verse described a fool who chose to be silent and was perceived as wise because of it. And this verse describes a fool who cannot meaningfully contribute in a high-stakes context because wisdom is simply beyond what they currently possess. Right? The first silence is chosen, and the second is imposed by the gap between what the context requires and what the fool has to offer. Even in Ecclesiastes 10:16, you know, it reinforces the communal stakes of this gap with appointed directness. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Right? The child king and the feasting princes are people in positions of authority who lack the wisdom that those positions require. And so the woe is not merely for them. It is actually for the land, for the community that depends on those positions being filled with real wisdom. The fool silent at the gate is, in one sense, the best possible outcome when a fool occupies a position that wisdom should fill. Far worse is the fool who does open their mouth in that context with confident foolishness that gets implemented. And so Proverbs 28:2 makes the civic dimension of this even more explicit, right? When a land transgresses, it has many rulers, but with a man of understanding and knowledge, its stability will long continue, right? And I think the stability of a community is directly connected to the wisdom of those who lead and make judgment within it, right? And so wisdom is not just personally beneficial, but its presence or absence in the gate, in the places where consequential decisions get made, shapes the well-being of everyone the community contains. So let's get practical here, right? Let's get applicable, because as I always say in my videos, I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important parts of our Christian walk. And so the first thing for us today is to take seriously the long-term work of building wisdom before we need it in high-stakes contexts. I think the most important application of this verse is the one that operates in advance of the gate rather than at it. Right? The fool's silence at the gate is not a problem that can be solved at the gate, but it is the product of accumulated choices made long before that moment arrived. You know, the person who has applied their heart to instruction, who has genuinely pursued wisdom over time, who has done the climbing rather than staying on low ground, is the person who can open their mouth at the gate because they have something worth saying. And so the time to prepare for the moments that require wisdom is not when those moments necessarily arrive, but it is in all the ordinary days before them. And so whatever gate we are being called toward, the preparation for having something worth saying in it is happening right now, and whether or not we are genuinely pursuing wisdom in the present. Second thing, honestly assess the gap between our position and the wisdom the context we occupy require. You know, one of the more uncomfortable but practically vital applications of this verse is the invitation to honestly evaluate whether we currently possess the wisdom that the positions and contexts we occupy actually require. Not as an exercise in self-condemnation, but as an honest audit of the gap between where we are and where we need to be. Right? The person who leads a team, raises children, serves in the church, or participates in any community that depends on their wisdom owes it to those communities to take seriously whatever they are ascending toward the wisdom the role requires, or remaining comfortable on lower ground. The fool at the gate is problematic not just for themselves, but the community that needed their wisdom is also the poorer for its absence. And then the third thing is to respond to our own silence at the gate with pursuit rather than shame. The third application is perhaps, I think, the most personally important, and it is directed at anyone who has experienced the feeling the verse describes. The moment when a situation required wisdom you did not have, and the wisdom was not chosen but exposed. And so that experience is not a verdict on your permanent position. It is data about the gap between where you are and where the climbing needs to take you. Right? Proverbs consistently presents the current position as a starting point rather than a fixed destiny. And the person who has found wisdom too high can begin ascending today, but the gate will come around again. The question, though, is whether the intervening time will be spent in the genuine pursuit of what was found to be lacking, or in the avoidance of the discomfort that the exposure produced. So let me just give a closing thought here, right? You know, Proverbs 24:7 is a verse about the relationship between what we invest in becoming and what we have to offer when it actually matters. Look, I mean, the gate is coming, right? For all of us, in one form or another. There are moments where real decisions with real stakes will require real wisdom. And the question of whether we have anything worth contributing will be measured by the work we did or did not do long before we arrived. And so wisdom is on the high ground, right? It does require genuine ascent. And the fools stayed on low ground and arrived at the gate empty. But the person of wisdom did the climbing and has something to say when the moment demands it. And so the gate is not the time to start climbing. The time to start is actually now.